Okay, the purpose of this video is to introduce you to the major arteries of the thoracic and abdominal region. So this is your chest cavity and then the abdomen where all the major digestive organs and liver and different things are located. So remember that there will be left and right for many of these things. You don't need to refer to those things. And I'll probably jump around here a little bit just because I think it makes more sense to do it that way. But let's go ahead and talk about where the heart would be. So the heart would be in this location. So we're finding the aortic arch, which we're familiar with. Then branching off, and I think this is letter B. I won't get all the letters right, I'm sure. The left and right coronary arteries. So those are branching off of we would refer to this as the ascending aorta, but the aortic arch, which then would become the thoracic aorta. And then once it passes through the diaphragm, we'll have the abdominal aorta. So those major vessels branching off of the arch, we've seen this several times, the brachiocephalic, and I think even on this plate it refers to that as the brachiocephalic trunk. I remember we've seen this idea of trunk means that it's generally a short blood vessel that will then branch off pretty quickly, just like the trunk of a tree. And this is a perfect example here. So this brachiocephalic is now going to branch off into the subclavian. We've seen that, and then the common carotid. First off, of the subclavian on both sides, and over here is the subclavian for the left side, you're going to have this internal thoracic. And that's going to be feeding your chest cavity, and it's going to branch off and even end up all the way down at your diaphragm. This is going to run right along that phrenic nerve that we saw previously. Then coming off, I've got this green blood vessel, and it's another trunk. It's really short, and this is the costocervical. Now, if you refer to it as the cervical costo, I will probably do that sometimes too. Not a big deal. You're just getting the two sides switched, which I don't think it's that important. But here's why it's called the costocervical. The cervical, because it's going to end up going up into, this branch is going to go up into the neck. And we saw that previously, actually, in one of the plates. Then costo means cartilage, if you remember cartilage, and that's going to be feeding the, or ribs. And so you're going to have this, what's called the highest intercostal. Now, inter means between. And so you're going to have these orange blood vessels running off. You have 9 of these, actually, on each side. And so I'm not going to label every single one of those on the purpose games or on the quizzes, but these are called the intercostal, and they're really feeding the muscle between your ribs. And those do serve a function, and they actually do help with breathing. So we had that highest intercostal, and that actually happens on both sides. And it's actually feeding the top 2 cervical intercostal arteries. Okay, so kind of reviewing here, we had the brachiocephalic, the carotid on both sides, the subclavian on both sides. Then we had that costocervical branch, or trunk. Then we had the highest intercostal. Then we've actually had our intercostal arteries that feed between. And again, you have 9 of those. You can see 7 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There'd actually be one here, and then the next rib down. So the way it's drawn, it's just hiding some of them. Okay, so let me finish this internal thoracic. It's going to branch, and it's like, say, why don't they call that a trunk? Well, it's much too long for a trunk, I guess. But it is going to branch into what's called and I sometimes do get these two mixed up, of which one's which. So you're going to have this one coming straight down. It's called the epigastric. It's upon or above the stomach. The stomach is going to be right down here. Although this is feeding the diaphragm, the epigastric. And then the one that comes off more to the left side, we call the musculophrenic. If you remember, we had that phrenic nerve that is controlling not necessarily controlling, but it does have some control over the diaphragm, like automatic breathing and whatnot. So I think that covers the ones that came off up here. Now, there's just a couple more here that are actually pretty obviously named. Both of these are coming off of the thoracic aorta. And so we're going to have what's called the bronchial arteries, and these are going to feed the bronchial tubes. And then you have the esophageal, which are feeding the esophagus. So the esophagus is coming down. We actually see the esophagus up here, and then there's trachea. The trachea comes down, passes behind the aorta, and then branches off to the right and left lungs. So the esophageal arteries and the bronchial arteries, which will feed the bronchial tubes. And those will get smaller and smaller to feed all of those different tubes. So hopefully that does a pretty nice job of explaining the upper body here. Now we're going to jump down. And the reason I've divided it into the upper cavity and the lower, just so the diagram's a little larger on the purpose games and quizzes. So now I'm going to jump down to the abdominal region. So remember, the diaphragm really divides the thoracic region from the lower abdominal region. And these are a lot of times going to be named for what they are actually going to feed. And we're obviously not doing every single blood vessel, and there are even some blood vessels that are drawn that are either labeled, but we're not going to add any extra ones in. So realizing that the aqua color here, here's now the abdominal aorta. It becomes that once it passes through the diaphragm. And the first significant structure we come to is a little short blood vessel here. It's pretty wide. It's probably called a trunk, and it is. It's called the celiac trunk, and the celiac trunk has multiple things that branch off from it. So celiac, if you've ever heard of celiac disease, that has to do with the intestines not working properly. And that's kind of the region that we're in here. So now we're down here. The stomach is going to be down here. The intestines are going to be down here. That's where a lot of the blood goes. A lot of the blood goes that is in the lower body. Branching off first, this is a very significant artery here. It would be very large. It's actually going to feed the largest internal organ you have of your body, and that is the liver. And this is referred to as the hepatic artery. So remember, hepato meant liver. Branching off up here, you are going to have the left gastric. This is going to be feeding the stomach. There is a right, but it's not shown here. So this brown color that I've done here is the left gastric. Then you have an organ over here, the spleen, and this is going to be the splenic. Remember, the spleen is actually responsible for filtering out old blood cells that have passed their life expectancy. So this is the splenic. Then you've probably recognized these two large organs down here. These are your kidneys, and so these are referred to as the renal arteries. And you have sitting on top of your kidneys, and we'll see these in the pigs. You actually have the adrenal gland. This is what makes adrenaline. If you kind of for your fight or flight response, and adrenaline, anytime you're nervous or anytime you are kind of in a situation that causes nervousness, adrenaline's made. And it's actually a kind of an evolutionary thing. If you need to run really fast, adrenaline's good, or have extra strength, that adrenaline will start flowing, and that kind of increases your heart rate and gets more blood pumped to deliver more oxygen and more nutrients more quickly. Okay, so back. So again, I want to review this real quick. The celiac trunk, we had the hepatic, we have the left gastric, and then we have the splenic. Then we have those renal arteries that do both branch off. And there's actually a little piece right back here that I should have colored in green. And I think in the quizzes, I actually kind of draw that artery across. Then we have this very large, significant, probably the largest of the branches off of the abdominal aorta. And this is the superior mesenteric. Mesenteric have to do with the viscera, have to do with the intestines. And so this is going to be feeding your large intestines. Now down below, if this is the superior mesenteric, I'm going to jump down here to actually the inferior mesenteric. So this will be feeding things, and we'll see this in the pig. We'll talk about mesenteries in the fetal pig. Then branching off, you have two of these that are branching off, and depending on if you're male or female, we name these differently. These are the ovarian or testicular. Oops, jumped again. The ovarian or testicular arteries, and you have one on each side. So they're both branching off of the abdominal aorta. Then we have these multiple small, in my case, red blood vessels. These are feeding the lumbar vertebrae, and they are just referred to as lumbar. Here you can see 4 of them. And I think that is actually all that you have in between each of the vertebral vertebrae. Then branching off of the abdominal aorta are what are called the common iliacs. They're called common because eventually, if something is called common, it's going to break off into an internal and external. The reason that the carotid is called the common carotid is because it's going to do the internal carotid, which goes to your brain, and the external carotid, which feeds the outside of your skull. Then the common carotid, I'm going to go ahead and put these in here. They're actually labeled in your text. So be aware of these. We're going to have the external external iliac, which is larger, and it's going to feed most of our leg. Then you have the internal iliac, which is going to feed some different lower gluteal muscles and things that are more in the gluteal region. The external is going to continue down all the way to the tips of your toes. So hopefully I hit all of the blood vessels of the abdomen. If you need to go back and review this, but hopefully this will be a good resource for you. Thanks.